part of the output and sending it back to here. Now this is where evaluation, I'll abbreviate it here, takes place. Now we can take what's already been put on the board here, you can't see it, it says desired behavior. So input you can think of as desired, and I'll change that, desired results. Now over here with your output, you have the actual results. So you are simply over here comparing what you want to have happened with what actually happened. And to the extent that they're not identical, you begin to take corrective action. And so we have to think in terms of not only ultimate feedback at the end of a program, at the conclusion of the program, but also thinking of feedback intermittently, so you know whether you're on target and you take some corrective action and try to get a little bit closer to the target. Now, what we can also do when we think of the program is to take this apart and think of it as a chain of events and also evaluating each part. Now, let's just do that over here, and I think in terms of the program, we can think, and you've been presented with a lot of it before, in terms of the traditional communications model. And that we know is the sender and the message and the media and the audience, and then finally the, I'll just put down EF4, effects. I think the key controversy in evaluation is that those who keep preaching to us that we must evaluate often think in terms of evaluating only the final output, the final result, or some people talk about the summative evaluation instead of the process evaluation. If we only think in terms of the ultimate evaluation, then I think we're going to get very disappointed in public relations. It's sort of like the question, are we a profession or aren't we? I like a chapter in Grunick's book who says we're working toward professionalism. And similarly, I think we're working toward evaluation of the ultimate end or purpose of the program. But let's not lose sight of all the intermediate ways in which we can evaluate. Now, for example, Jerry talked about clippings. This is the traditional evaluation that has been done. You get your little scrapbook and you have all the clippings and you paste them in there, and I'm not entirely knocking it. There are still some managers who'll accept that. And it is impressive. It shows what we accomplish in terms of media relations. Now, where we can begin to sharpen up is not to be satisfied either with clippings, which I would say is the cave stone age, nor with the Ketchum approach where we use computers and we try to get into fine points. Instead, I would go back to Armstrong Cork and what happened there. They used the clippings, and then they wanted to use a little drama. They said, well, after all, we're in this business of floor covering, so let's get a little carpet and let's clip all the clippings on there, pin the clippings on there. And then very dramatically, when we give our annual report, we'll unfoil the carpet and down will go the entire room and down the stairs and all that. And each year it got a little bit longer until the boss said, okay, you've convinced me, you know, you really are effective in media relations, but what has it accomplished for us? Now, okay, that manager was asking that end result, what about sales? Now, there are a lot of things that happen before sales, and the point that one of the speakers there made, a man by the name of Marker, was this. We can analyze the clippings in terms of the kinds of messages or message themes that we wanted to get across. One of the products that they had was a paste-on linoleum square. They wanted to point out that it had self-adhesive on it. It was a simple thing for any person to do. Now, if that feature was mentioned in an article, then Armstrong Cork felt that they went a little bit further in ultimate effectiveness, because that theme was important if indeed it was going to lead to enhanced sales. Now, this is an assumption that's made. If that point gets across, more people are going to buy it. Now, what they also did to satisfy those who wanted the ultimate evaluation is to use certain publicity in communities, also ads in communities, and then find out whether sales of those particular products with that particular feature did in fact rise in those communities where an effort was made. And then you had other communities, control communities. So this was a way of measuring the impact of media relations. Now, ATT was also interested in the impact of publicity, and so what they wanted to do was to find out whether the articles that appeared in the wire services were, and here they said, let's find out, are they favorable or unfavorable toward ATT? We want to measure that, not just whether they mentioned us by name. They also did an analysis and found out whether some of them were subject to a rebuttal. And then they developed a rebuttal ratio so that later on they could test themselves and say, okay, we've rebutted these, but we haven't rebutted the others. Now, instead of doing it nationwide, they also did it for particular regions of the country, and they did it for particular newspapers to find out which newspapers were biased against them. And then, okay, what do you do with them? You know, maybe you bypass them and you go for advertising instead of publicity. So in other words, the idea here was you want to go into all of the intermediate steps before you reach the ultimate step of have sales actually gone up. Now, one case study, and maybe I shouldn't get into them because you haven't gotten into yours yet, but to give you an example, American Can Company, incidentally, some public relations firms publish a little sheet, which I imagine they give to their clients, and this is a Carl Bayer one. Carl Bayer is now part of Philip Milton, as you know. It's a neat little summary. It tells you what the situation is, and then the research that was done to explore the situation, and then the planning, that usually includes objectives, and then the execution, and then always at the end, evaluation. They use the format, I guess, of Silver Anvil Awards, which shows the status of evaluation. You can't do without. Well, here with American Can, this was the client that they had. American Can said they were getting a little bit worried because they were diversifying into so many fields, including financial services, that a lot of their regular customers were beginning to feel they were going out of the packaging industry. And this might mean that their steady customers were going to look around for some other supplier to give them what they needed in packaging. So their objective here was not a tremendously large one. In fact, in the communications theory, one of the terms that I encounter more and more is the expression, let's be satisfied with either moderate goals or intermediate goals. And so their goal here was not mainly in influencing ultimate behavior, although this is the kind of situation I described, but for this particular part of the program, they wanted to affect one thing, the perceptions, I'm sure Pat Jackson mentioned that word, perceptions, of the people out there who were either their customers now or might be potential customers. And they wanted to develop some program that would indicate that they have not abandoned the packaging world, but we're still very much in there. So they then described the program. They went to their research and development staff They found out what new products there were, and you can imagine the publicity that ensued, and I don't want to get into that. But when I read then what they say about evaluation, they say here, first of all, the kind of clippings approach, that articles dealing with American canned packaging innovations appeared in more than 40 major newspapers, 50 trade publications, a number of important business and general media outlets, and several key television stations. Now, this is usually as far as we go. And this is talking about the means. It does not say, have we accomplished something? So let's see then if they say more. Then they say American canned packaging executives report a dramatic increase in customer and industry awareness of the company's packaging business and a sharp rise in the number of sales leads. Now, you see, here again, I would say sometimes, if you think of an exhibit, for example, we may be satisfied not in ultimate sales. We're not responsible for that part, but we are responsible for increasing the number of sales leads. And I'm sure Jerry's thinking the same thing I am, but what's the quality of the sales lead? And then ultimately, we would want to find out when those sales leads do lead in ultimate sales. So what I'm saying here is we ought to sometimes look at the components of the process. And this is the part which we don't call, say, summative evaluation or the ultimate output evaluation, but we're calling it process evaluation. Or once I called it in one of my books, instrumental evaluation. So we want to find out what can be said, how we can evaluate each one of these components. Now, with the sender, for example, I think it's appropriate to say that the corporate image studies or organizational image studies that are done in many ways evaluate the reputation of the sender, the credibility of the sender. So this is a legitimate process kind of evaluation that is done. Now, every organization is going to have its ideal self-image. And then when it looks at surveys, it probably finds that nobody quite thinks of them as highly as they think of themselves. And there's a gap, and they try to narrow that gap. Okay, what I think image evaluation does is really kind of check out the sender. And here's an article of faith where we say, we assume that when the reputation of an organization is high, that it's going to fare better with regard to a lot of different objectives. Now again, I'm just saying this is kind of an intermediate goal, a process goal. I'm not totally happy with it, but if we want to check this out, fine. Now General Dynamics had to check that out because they got into trouble with the government. They were doing a little cheating. And incidentally, the way they try to improve their image, and I guess did succeed, they hired an ethics program from one of the many consulting firms and nonprofit firms in the field. And simply by indoctrinating their managers with a new sense of ethics, they were able to convince government, at least, that they were going to live up to the reputation that they hoped to have. Now, when we look at message, there are a lot of evaluation instruments that can be used here. We talk about readability, which is a form of evaluation. That's one way. We can also use another little technique, signaled stopping technique. You simply take anything that has been written by you or somebody else. You can read it yourself, or hopefully ask somebody else to do it. And every time you stop for some reason or another, you put a little slash behind that word. And then you try to analyze why you put the slash there. Now, it may be because you couldn't quite understand what you wrote, or somebody else couldn't understand what you wrote. In other words, it needs clarification. It may be that the idea was so good that you wanted to brood over it a little bit. You wanted it to sink in a little bit more. So maybe this is the particular objective of it. It may be you want to ask a question of the writer. Now again, this may indicate that you don't really understand it well enough. You may want to respond by saying, you know, I agree with this point, and I don't agree with this other point. Okay, the point is that you may want to evaluate your message not only in terms of readability, how easy it is or how difficult it is to read, but also in terms of how are people going to perceive it. So then you can check out the message and feel a little bit better about it. Now, with media, too much maybe has been already said about that. We talked about clippings, and then we went beyond that. And with other media, of course, sometimes people are satisfied with mere head counting, which is very trivial, very inadequate. But again, as a way of checking out that a particular medium worked, it's important. And then with the audience, this is where we get to the surveys that are done and to find out what has happened to people. The main thing I can say about audience is that, again, we go back to a kind of hierarchy of effects. I assume that this has been discussed by Pat. Am I right here? Hierarchy of effects. It's one of his favorite topics. No?
He may have done it under, was he talking about attitudes, perceptions, and behavior?
Okay. This is basic.
Opinions, attitudes, and
Okay, there's a kind of a minimum list on the hierarchy of effects. And the main point is that because so much emphasis has been put here on desired behavior, that again, instead of going to the ultimate end, we may want to look at intermediate goals. Now, the hierarchy of effects, the simple model is sometimes we want to create awareness for something, mere awareness, attract attention to something. Then, number two, we want to create understanding. And if we want to measure understanding, we better be very explicit, not just that broad term, my program is going to create understanding, but can you list precisely what it is that you want people to know? Are there some product features? Are there some traits about your organization? That, I think, is a part of evaluation. And I think the computer, incidentally, has helped because the computer always asks us to put down certain categories with content analysis or whatever. So we're kind of disciplined. We can't be vague anymore. In fact, it reminds me of when I met a faculty member at BU who was so immersed in the computer world, and he asked me what his course evaluation was, as a matter of fact. And I happened to have seen it. It was awful, actually awful. Now, being in public relations, I didn't want to come right out and say, hey, George, this is terrible. You know, you got an awful evaluation. I wanted to be diplomatic. Well, you know what I'm talking about, Alex. Anyhow, he couldn't understand diplomacy. He couldn't understand any hedging on it. He said, well, tell me, Otto, am I excellent? Am I very good? Good? Poor? Very poor? You know, give me the categories. And I was put on the spot, and I said, George, very poor. You know? In fact, then I was encouraged. I said, you went off the scale. You know, he asked for it, and there's something about a computer person, they become hardware. You know, you don't think of them as software anymore, and he could really take it. But this is what we've got to do when we think of awareness and then understanding and trying to get the specific content categories. Now, beyond understanding, there is also acceptance. We assume that attitudes may be altered somewhat. And then we have behavior. Now, that's the simple list. Now, let me give you a little longer one. I refer to a book which goes on and on with regard to sales. Now, attention I've mentioned, comprehension. But then, just to point out that this particular writer said, let's talk about knowledge gain, just to make sure we're not too fuzzy about comprehension. And then he said, after understanding, there might be a preference that is developed. A preference. Then attitude change. And then then he talks about memory. Now, this is sort of saying we've got to pay attention to the fact that in our kind of society, we don't get exposed to a message and then we immediately act on it. It's not like going to a rally. Okay, we're going to march against the palace and attack it. No, days go by, weeks go by, maybe months go by. So we have to pay attention to whether or not people are able to keep something in their minds. And also, we have to distinguish between short-term memory and long-term memory. And increasingly, as I become a pioneer, I realize that you have to make a deliberate effort sometimes to tell yourself, I want to commit this to long-term memory. Now, simply because you're exposed to so many new ideas, you've got to make that conscious decision, increasingly as you become a pioneer. Okay, then you make a pre-decision. Now, other language that's used for this is maybe you end up with an intention. Now, we've all heard about intentions, and we're all very suspicious of intentions. But this has a meaning. And then that intention may indeed be converted into some kind of behavior. And then in this particular chart, the point is made, do you have not only an immediate sale, but do you have long-term sales too? So in other words, when you get into the audience and the hierarchy of effects and all the things that happen, we may want to check out each particular component and see whether or not we succeed with that. And then with effects, this is where we're right back to the cybernetics model, and we are then looking at the ultimate actual results and seeing whether this meets with the desired results. So this is the model that I've been using to introduce the basic notion of what evaluation is. And then the other model I like to use is the one I showed you where we become aware of the process, and you can do it either in terms, well, first in terms of the communications model and just looking at each one of the elements, and then secondly, with the elements, you can check out whether or not that particular part works. So let me stop here for a moment and see if we want to interact or whether you want.
Another 10 minutes.
10 minutes? Well, I've got 3 cases, but at this point, are there any questions before we go to those? So, because if we go to the cases, I mean, they're like 4 or 5 hours.
Okay, Alex?
15 minutes, Jerry.
Sure is.
15 minutes.
Yeah.
On my part here, I think it was argued this afternoon that what you referred to as effects, what I guess Pat called the desired behaviors,
Yeah.
are the ultimate thing that you're going to be judged on. Now, by what you're talking about here, could you in fact succeed in your evaluation in your own mind and prove it to management? And if you've gotten all parts of your process right except for the end result, then you've done just fine and you're going to keep the job.
It depends on my boss. I have a feeling if I had a boss like Jerry, he's not going to be satisfied. I think
no matter
if,
how much you argued that your process was beautiful.
yeah, in terms of my own superego, I always would like to go the last mile. And, in some ways, let me say, this is the first time I've talked on evaluation, the subject of evaluation, where I've given this much emphasis to process evaluation. And I think the reason I'm doing that is because if I stick to only the sky, the heavens, then there are too many who are going to go away and say, well, I can't possibly achieve that ultimate goal. So I may as well give up. So now I'm saying my objectives are intermediate objectives, and I'm saying reach for the heavens, but if you can't quite reach it, or if you can't, if you don't have the budget for it, if you're not allowed the budget, then at least become aware of some of these intermediate measurements that may be taken, which check out the system. And I think the system is a kind of weakest link in the chain system, so that if you have everything right, but one part doesn't go right, then it's going to collapse. You may have the most beautiful message in the world, but if media relations goes awry, then where are you? And so,
Actually, I agree with you on that. It comes down to a question of how well the client is educated about the process and about the realities of our business. I've been in many situations in which we did not indeed achieve a specific objective, but the process was right, and frequently there were circumstances beyond our control, like an inferior product, inability to build a distribution network, off-the-mark advertising, anything like that, any one of a number of things that could go awry that are totally beyond our control, so we end up not achieving what we set out to do. Nonetheless, it's clear because of the process that we went through and the degree to which we communicated with the clients and and all that we were as successful as we could be given the confines of reality. So it can work out that way.
okay, I think another point that can be made is this. Over time, you may learn through experience as to which part of the chain is the weakest. And then I would say, okay, if you know that in past efforts you failed somewhere, then this is a message to you. You better check out that particular part and improve on it, learn. Again, the cybernetics mechanism is really a learning mechanism. It says, let's be an open organization. Let's be an open person. Let's face reality. Let's not obliterate unwelcome news or deny it or distort it. This is easy to say, but we know in our personal lives that this is what we do all the time. We duck anything that is unpleasant. That's what Freud talked about when he talked about ego defenses. And so it requires a great deal of courage to say, now, I'm going to face up to the real results, reality, and I'm going to try to learn from my experience, even though it's going to be hard to take. Now, if you have the cybernetics model built into you, that's the way you live. And incidentally, if this point hasn't gotten across as it's getting colder out, this is a thermostat. You set your desired temperature. This is the actual temperature. It goes back, tells you it's still 10 degrees too cold. Turn the oil burner on a little longer, until you get, until you achieve the desired result. Only that's easy. All you do is have more effort. It's like in advertising, repeat, repeat, repeat. Maybe you want to throw the oil burner out and move over to something different, use a different tool. So anyhow, any questions on this model?
One other comment, if I may, on that. So much of this really hinges on the degree to which your ability in the first place to set up realistic expectations and realistic objectives, and your ability and willingness to take a stand with the client. Okay? If you see the client, again, going into a situation expecting the unexpectable, the undoable, the unrealistic, it's incumbent on all of us to let that be known at that point. Because if we don't let it be known at that point, we're the ones who end up paying the price when the results aren't there. And you don't want to carry that burden. Not fair.
Yes, sir.
Just a quick question. I assume the data collection and computer time for evaluation of the program is to the client's account?
Yeah. In evaluation, and here are the points that they make. And now this is your test to see whether you're going to be satisfied with these results. Result number one, nearly 99% of all middle and junior high schools in the area served by Northeast Utilities, and then they give a number for that, requested the kit. This is this special kit that they prepared the first year it was offered. In some school districts, all science teachers of target ages asked for it. So in other words, 99% of all of the relevant schools asked for this particular kit. Are you happy? No. That's the right answer. It's only a means. And so, the teachers are happy. It gives them something to use. Maybe the kids are happy. But this is not bottom line. It's sort of like an employee relations program. Job satisfaction is high. Everybody's just crazy about the job because there's a country club atmosphere. But what about productivity? And so that's the kind of question. What is this accomplishing? Then number two, though designed for middle school grades. I am a pioneer. I'm having trouble reading. 18 high schools asked for the program. So, in other words, not only the target audience, but others asked for it. And nothing more is said about that. And then dozens of unsolicited letters commending the program were received from teachers. Again, you don't look happy. I'm not even going to ask you whether this is right. And then finally, other utilities and State Department and the State Department of Education asked for the kit. Now, you see, this is the old-fashioned section on evaluation, where you're simply happy with the fact that